In the summer of 1984, Joe Dante and Chris Columbus introduced us to the lovable and yet destructive Mogwai in Gremlins. They would spin off into video games and merchandise, would be referenced in media continually to this day, and would become a landmark cultural darling of 1980s cinema. But the thing that I find most captivating about the release of Gremlins is its impact on the horror genre, as it would forever change how small creepy things in horror would be viewed and portrayed in most films until present day. You see, before Gremlins, you would have flying silver balls, birds, voodoo dolls, insects, mutants, little people, astronauts, dolls, flies, babies, and, other babies? And the only design aspect that ties them all together is that they have no common design elements. They are all entirely different from one another besides their size, while also not exhibiting any real cute character design traits in any sense as the average person would see it. They are all upsetting in their own different ways. They are all made to be as scary as they can be. But almost exclusively everything that would come after Gremlins that involved scary little things would be directly inspired by how that movie made the audience feel about the antagonistic little creatures. In that now cute or fun aesthetics would be incorporated into character designs to overlay a deeper hidden chaotic malice. The dolls would become cuter, the creatures would become fuzzier, and for the next 5 years the similarities of some of these films would be so close that they should be seen more as rip-offs of Gremlins than anything else. The first of these came in 1985 in the form of Ghoulies, which was the first film to feature a Gremlins-like name that would become a mainstay of small creature features until present day. Warner Brothers actually tried to sue them for the use of the title, claiming that it was too similar to the word Gremlins and would create market confusion, but ultimately they lost that case when it went to court. This was also the first Gremlins-like movie that features a small monster that Charles Band would work on, if you don't count Parasite in 1982. We've talked about him before in a few other videos, but he would go on to work on over 300 movies, and a strangely large amount of them would be about small monsters. In fact, a great percentage of the films that I'm going to mention in this video were created by one of his production studios, and he has largely helped to keep the small monster genre alive for the past 30 years. The argument can be made that Ghoulies is in fact not a ripoff of Gremlins, and its close release to that film is merely a coincidence. Ghoulies was in production at the same time as Gremlins, even though it was released over 6 months after that film, and the Ghoulies themselves bear little design inspiration from the Mogwai. The film is also very much stuck in the mindset of pre-Gremlins small-statured horror, as along with the nasty designs of the Ghoulies, they also use little people actors to add surrealism to scenes of the film, something that was really popular before Gremlins in films like The Sinful Dwarf, Willy Wonka, and Forbidden Zone, which is something that would slowly be over time phased out in most media. This didn't stop the comparisons from being made though between the two films, as at the time of its release the New York Times called the film a cut-rate Gremlins about some small, nasty creatures brought forth by a man dabbling in the occult. Like most Charles Band films, this one is not very good, but it is crazy. That is the one thing that I always like to say about the work that comes from his studios, is that every time you watch one, you don't really know what you're going to get, but you can be guaranteed that it will be bad, crazy, and a whole lot of fun. And really, where else are you going to watch Jack Nance from Eraserhead and Twin Peaks blast lasers out of his eyes while choking a man in a wizard battle, only to then get struck by lightning and explode, never to be seen again? Critters in 1986 would be the first true style ripoff that piggybacked off the success of Gremlins by making the titular mini-monsters have their own aspect of cuteness to their design while also being fun and energetic. Out of all the movies that I would consider a ripoff of Gremlins, Critters is the only one that I feel stands up on its own as a movie and franchise starter. And even though I don't often agree with Roger Ebert, I think he put it best in his review at the time of the film's release when he said, "What makes Critters more than a ripoff are its humor and its sense of style. This is a movie made by people who must have had fun making it." Munchies in 1987 is the most overt of the bad ripoffs to the point that they probably should have been a little ashamed of themselves. It's a horrible movie that was filmed in only 12 days, and the Munchies work in the exact same way that the Gremlins do. When it starts out, we have one sweet monster who forms a bond with a boy, who then splits off into several evil monsters who wreak havoc and love drinking and eating and chasing after women. The best part is getting to watch Harvey Korman play a character and also that character's evil twin. And anytime he's on screen, you can't help but laugh at how much he's enjoying himself with the knowledge of how bad the movie he's currently in is. And lastly, in 1988, the Hobgoblins were unfortunately unleashed onto the screen in one of the worst films ever made. There's a whole Mystery Science 3000 episode about this movie, and there are very few movies that I would call unwatchable, but this is one of them. Everything about it is off-putting, the people don't act like people, the monsters are some of the worst of the subgenre, and it isn't even fun to watch in its bland badness, to the point that I couldn't even bring myself to finish it, which is something that I pretty much never do. But the thing that all of these movies are missing is that Gremlins is a horror movie that has a lot of heart to it, which is something that for some reason I feel isn't often considered within the genre. One of the cheapest scenes that you can film are two people sitting in a room talking to each other. But these kinds of moments are really important because they offer ways to develop character, which is something that Gremlins did really well. Movies are scarier and the stakes are higher when we actually care about what happens to these people who are on screen. And not a lot of these small creature features take the effort to go there with their human protagonists. Gremlins has that Joe Dante, Steven Spielberg, Kathleen Kennedy kind of touch of wholesomeness to it. And the characters all feel remarkably real. Not only that, but their worlds feel hyper-real and lived in. And the use of matte paintings in a lot of the scenes that show off their surroundings create the atmosphere of an idealized version of a 1980s small town. All of the films that they worked on in this time had a similar feeling of fun with a human spirit to it, no matter what the genre was, and is the reason that those films have lived on today, and why this style defined the feeling of what a certain type of 80s movie should feel like. There's a reason that Gremlins broke past the horror constraints, and into a place of being loved as a cultural landmark of that decade, because it treated its characters like real people that audiences could relate to before anything horrific ever happens to them. Character is a massive part of storytelling, and is what will keep audiences returning over time. And that to me is the biggest aspect that the ripoffs of Gremlins are missing, because even though some of them are quite fun, I wouldn't really describe any of these movies as human stories in the same way that Gremlins is. But there are also movies that came out in this time period that are definitely inspired by Gremlins, but don't go so far as to rip it off, such as Troll in 1986, which was another Charles Band production. It's really interesting to me on a few levels. It is the rare movie that is less famous than its sequel, as the completely unrelated sequel, Troll 2, has become a popular meme online for the last decade. The film was written by Ed Naha, and while not very well known, remains one of my favorite creative people in film at this time, just because his body of work speaks to me. His credits include movies like Dolls, Spellcaster, Chud 2, and the Honey I Shrunk the Kids franchise. And what I love about his writing is his ability to blend genre fiction with likable characters in that great 1980s camp style. And I think that talent is on full display in Troll, and is one of the things that makes this movie fun to watch. Because without this story behind it, I don't know that most of these effects would have nearly the same level of charm that they do. The movie definitely isn't great. It has a 4.5 rating on IMDb that it probably deserves. But there's just something about it that I find really quaint and enjoyable, and it has some of the most unique creatures in the small monster subgenre. The design of the troll is both cute and fun, like Gizmo, but the other small monsters throughout it are pretty different from one another, and result in a really enjoyable fantasy horror movie that takes place entirely in an apartment building. In my opinion, not only did Gremlins inspire the cute aspect of micro-horror villains, it also was the direct result in the boom of small monsters on film, whether they resembled the Gremlins physically or not. Before its release, the only small horror villains of note over a roughly 70-year span are in Freaks, The Birds, The Other, Cujo, Phantasm, Eraserhead, Trilogy of Terror, Rats, a few episodes of The Twilight Zone, Basket Case, The Pit, The Boogans, Squirm, The Swarm, It's Alive, Creepshow, and The Fly. And in this time you can see that pretty much all small-statured horror villains were either children, animals, or bugs. And as far as character design is concerned, these monsters were all over the place. Animal attack movies in this time were really popular also and made up their own subgenre of films, but a lot of them could probably fit here depending on the size of the animal. But in just the next 10 years after Gremlins, you have an absurd amount of movies that utilize these kinds of creatures, including Cat's Eye, Beasties, Attack of the Beast creatures, Spookies, Dolls, Child's Play, Sorority Babes in the Slime Ball-orama, Puppet Master, Elves, Hemoglobin, The Unborn, Demonic Toys, Seed People, Leprechaun, Leaping Leprechauns, Subspecies, Little Devils, Slappy the Dummy, and all of the sequels and spin-offs and franchises that were birthed out of these. And that's not really even all of them. So in a way, Gremlins, I think, was kind of a genre starter, or at least ignited common ideas in a lot of different creators. As it certainly didn't invent the small movie monster, but it did define what that kind of movie should look like to most audiences. Even still today, if a monster is presented in a small form, it will usually have some sort of cute aesthetic built into its character design that makes the horrific aspects that much more upsetting.
Cute, right?
But for me, there is one small monster movie from this time that stands out from the rest of them. And that is because it does something that is important to the small monster genre that it does better than any other entry. Even though the visual effects of Gremlins are charming today and were impressive for their time, pretty much every small monster movie that wasn't played by a human like the Leprechaun looked kind of unreal in a Yoda kind of way. They are all obviously puppets, and they don't try to get around that. And as an audience member, at least for me, it isn't difficult to look beyond that usually to become immersed in the world of that story. But what I love about 1987's The Gate is that they sat down and asked, what if we don't have to use puppets? What if there's a better way to go about this? The effects for this movie were better than pretty much every horror movie coming out even today. The fluid look of these monsters when they move is incredibly impressive to me, and that is because they aren't puppets, and they aren't animated, but instead are full-grown men in suits, filmed from very particular angles, using extra-large sets, in a technique called forced perspective. My favorite shot in pretty much all of 80s horror cinema is in this movie, using this technique right here, where a zombie falls and bursts into a tiny army of minions. And the only way to be able to do something like this well would have been through this technique. And the way that it's done is pretty cool. To my understanding, this is how the trick works. The far wall, the bed, as well as the children are all suspended in the air with the camera. The rest of the room and the floor is a large stage down below them, designed to line up with the wall that is floating in the air with the children. And in front of the camera is an extra large replica of the zombie. The first part of the trick is to let the zombie fall, then they stop filming and replace the zombie with men crouched down in the minion suits. And then they are all filmed jumping out and rolling around. And when edited together, it happens so fast that it looks shockingly realistic even by today's standards. It isn't a technique that special effects supervisor Randall William Cook invented, as it appears in a lot of early films such as Citizen Kane, Casablanca, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, as well as a Laurel and Hardy bit where they both play themselves and their sons. And so, even though he didn't pioneer the craft of forced perspective, it's one that he became a master of. And what this lends to a film is a sense of strong realism. The minions here feel like they are actually there because they are actually real people physically interacting with real objects. Which is just something you can't ever fully achieve with puppets or stop animation no matter how good the production value is. There will always be a little uncanniness to it. These creatures just feel like they are in these scenes more than the Gremlins do in theirs, at least to me. And if there's a place that the small monster genre can explore more in the future, it is this, I think, as it is a technique that is still almost never done, because it is difficult and expensive to plan and pull off. But what it is able to achieve is worth it in my opinion if it is a possible route for a production to take, as without it, The Gate would not be well remembered today. And if you're watching this and thinking to yourself that all of this sounds familiar to you for some reason, then you aren't wrong. As about a decade later, Randall William Cook would be flown to New Zealand to use these exact same tricks that he developed here to create hobbits and dwarves out of full-grown men for Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings. The forced perspective shots are a large part of what these movies are remembered for. And if The Gate hadn't been made, then that trilogy very well could have looked very different than it does today. My favorite trick used in the films was actually for this scene, which doesn't seem to be a trick at all. But in order to get this level of detail on the ring, while also keeping Frodo and Aragorn in the frame at the same time, the effects team created a massive scale ring to use on a giant chain. In fact, most of the time when you see the One Ring in the trilogy in a close-up when someone isn't holding it, it was probably this giant scale version. Child's Play did this kind of technique as well, having small actors wearing Chucky's suit on extra large sets. But they sadly only used this for a few shots in the whole film, and never really brought it back for any of the sequels. Which is a shame because I think these spare few shots are still the best that Chucky ever looked while moving in the entire franchise. And this tradition of creeping little monsters in horror continues to this day, with recent releases such as Blood Gnome, Feeding Frenzy, Devil Dolls, The Furfangs, Little Creeps, Chubbies, Bad Milo, Slimy Little Bastards, Ghastlies, Yoga Hosers, and Ouijies, to name a few. And with most of them, they continue with this style that Gremlins set forth in making chaotic small creatures. And with this, I am not trying to say here that I think Child's Play, or Puppet Master, or Leprechaun ripped off Gremlins. They are all really different movies when you break them apart from their small-statured creatures. But if there was a common theme for this channel, it would be that everything is connected. Nothing exists within a vacuum by itself, because everything that has ever been made has to exist in the same space as everything that has come before it, in an unending chain of creation and art. One thing always leads to another, and through that it is very interesting to me to see a subgenre build around this one movie, and to see what things were taken from it and what was left behind. Because for the most part, the style of Gremlins very much lives on today in many films, but the heart of it has kind of been dropped, at least for this type of movie. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. Some of these movies are incredibly fun, but most of them are not captivating on an emotional level. Leprechaun is my favorite horror franchise of all time, but I don't love those movies because how they use emotion in relation to their characters to make me feel something. I love them because they are about a little monster causing mayhem and tons of fun carnage and destruction. And that is ultimately the appeal of pretty much every single one of these movies that have followed in Gremlins' footsteps. What I just said about Leprechaun could also be said about Child's Play or Puppet Master or Slappy the Dummy or any of these monsters. And so, at least within the horror genre, I would argue that the legacy of Gremlins is not the endearing story, but instead the fun chaos of unleashing little creatures onto a lot of innocent, unsuspecting people who are not prepared for them, and letting us see what happens with that. But something I would like to see more of in the future is to have the subgenre evolve, with more small monsters that are still chaotic, but used in a way to tell more human stories. The amount of time has passed to where ripoffs of Gremlins can now be referred to as homages in some cases. And I would love to see something try and capture the essence of that storytelling style while using small monsters to help get to that goal, rather than using small monsters for small monsters' sake. I love both types of these movies, but when looking at the subgenre since the release of Gremlins, the scale is definitely skewed closer to one side than the other. And while I love seeing monsters create total unhinged chaos, the purpose of monsters in fiction is traditionally to reveal something about our identity, or our fears. Monsters reflect us, and the earlier small monsters knew that and used that for storytelling advantages, to tell stories about the uncertainties that come with an unplanned childbirth, the fear of intruders in our space and lives, a fear of our own children, or our pets, the fear of letting the things that we hold closest to us grow out of hand and destroy us. And I would personally just love to see what someone did with that today.